In this world, is the destiny of man controlled by some transcendental entity or law? Is it like the hand of God hovering above? At least it is true that man has no control, even over his own free will. These are the lines that open the first numbered chapter of Berserk. They're meant to give readers a general idea about the philosophy of the series, but they fit one character's arc in particular like a glove fits a hand. If you've clicked on this video after seeing its title, you know which character we're talking about, but do you know everything about the man formerly known as Griffith? Well, don't worry if the answer is no, because that's why we made this video. Today, we bring to you 30 facts about Griffith from Berserk Explored. Let's begin. Griffith is an orphan. Many people in the Band of the Falcon follow Griffith, but at the same time are confused by his changing demeanor. When it comes to business, Griffith is a total boss. He can outsmart people twice or even thrice his age and make it look as easy as pie. But there are also moments where Griffith behaves like a proper child, like when he has that water fight with Guts and then calls it good morning exercise. Griffith is somehow a grown-up who hasn't figured out how to grow up, and the reason behind that is that he's an orphan. Now, being an orphan doesn't necessarily mean you'll always have a childish mentality left over from your days as an orphan, but we also have to remember that the orphanage system wasn't as organized in the Middle Ages as it is today. As far as we can tell, Griffith never really went to one. He just raw-dogged life until he gathered enough men to start the Band of the Falcon, and once he did, he was consumed completely by the thought of becoming a king. Griffith might feel like a grown-up because of his personality, but in reality, he's just a kid with grand dreams. This is confirmed by the hallucination he has of himself in Chapter 72, and how his eclipse depicts what he truly thinks of himself, a child playing a game, and his being an orphan has a huge role to play in that. Traditionally, parental figures are the ones who impart a child with their understanding of the world. Parents teach their kids what's right from wrong, help develop their moral compass, and are supposed to act as a safety blanket. Griffith never had anything like that. He has no idea that the ends justifying the means is a philosophy espoused by one of humanity's coldest political thinkers. He grew up scrounging for scraps and playing games with the other orphans from his birth city. He didn't have anyone telling him, hey kid, maybe becoming king of the world is a bad idea for someone like you. The point we're trying to make here is that many of Griffith's motivations in life stem from the fact that he didn't have anyone to guide him, and so being an orphan is a huge aspect of his past that informs his present and his future. It's not that his attempt to gain a crown is wrong, it's that the way he chose to go about it was terrible, and if he had parental figures in his life, he might have understood that the means mean more than the end. He thinks he'll be some great king if he just gets the throne, but that's not true. A king's most important quality is to be able to make hard decisions while staying within the laws of the realm. Griffith constantly breaks those laws to further his own personal agenda, because he doesn't know any better. Even Guts, for all his personality deficiencies, had Gambino and Shisu to teach him what works and what doesn't, but Griffith, nada. And so this fact about his life is perhaps one of the most important things to keep in mind about him as we go further down the rabbit hole. Griffith most likely grew up in a Tudor city. One of the most mysterious things about Griffith is his birth city. All we know about where Griffith was born is that it had cobblestone pathways and a castle overseeing the entire place from a fortified hill. Griffith used to spend most of his time in the back alleys of this city playing with his friends, and then one day he saw the castle and knew it was what he wanted most in this world. After that realization, he got to work on building the Band of the Falcon, and by the time he turned 20, he was winning hearts all across Midland. There are almost zero clues as to the location of his birth city, except for the architecture of the castle and the first high-ranking noble he ever worked for. Let's get the latter out of the way first, because as a Berserk fan, there's no way you don't know this guy. Griffith's first foray into high politics came when he became a contracted mercenary for Governor Genin. By the time he joined the 100-Year War on Midland's side, Genin had risen to the position of Governor General of the Tudor Empire, which hints that Griffith himself comes from Tudor territory. This idea is reinforced by the architecture of his dream castle. If you take a look at the way it's constructed, it has conical domes crowning its towers. This particular style of roofing was quite popular in French Normandy and Baroque architecture. While the latter didn't originate in France, it has its roots in France, and Murat's Tudor Empire is an allegory for the French, with the 100-Year War basically being a reference to the eternal enmity between the French and the British. He also had a tendency to draw on real-life architecture to create his structures, like how Doldry is fashioned after Castillo di Coca, a real-life life fortress in Spain. Putting all these factors together, we can conclude that Griffith most likely comes from Tudor territory, and that would make a whole lot of sense. Tudor was in an amazing position when Griffith joined Midland's side. He knew Midland was vulnerable, and he applied the knowledge he'd gained by living in Tudor territory to turn the tables on them during the campaign. While this might never be confirmed, based on our analysis, Griffith's birth city is most likely within the Tudor Empire, and that's as close as anyone has gotten to answering that question. Griffith was a thief before he was a mercenary. This one won't be that tough to decipher because, frankly, it's pretty much spelled out for us during Casca's flashback chapters. When Griffith decided to become king, he might not have had any sense of practicality in terms of knowing how impossible his ambition was to achieve, but he did have practicality in the sense of using everything he got his hands on to maximize possible potential. The Band of the Falcon was started by him with only a handful of people under his command, and chief among them were Shoujo, Pippin, and most importantly, Corcus. As crazy as that sounds, Corcus most likely inspired Griffith's early drive to secure resources because before becoming a Falcon, he was the leader of a band of 10 thieves. Presumably, all those thieves joined up with Griffith thanks to his charisma, and when that happened, Griffith realized stealing was one of the fastest ways to obtain resources without wasting time. When he saved Casca's life from that rotten aristocrat who wanted to abuse her, he didn't do it because he was a nice guy, he did it because he was already targeting said aristocrat's wagon, intending to rob him blind. This is made pretty clear by the methodical way in which the nascent Falcons strip said nobleman's wagon of all the resources they can lay their hands on before Shoujo urges them to scoot. And then, later on in life, when the band's plans for living large fell through, Shoujo's first thought is to create a band of thieves to look after Griffith. This suggests that the nascent Falcons had quite a bit of experience in thievery, and that Griffith himself was a part of that experience. He got his Crimson Behelit from a gypsy fortune teller. It seems as though Miura's original concept for Behelits would have seen them cycle through a bunch of hands before landing in the right ones. The first Behelit we ever saw in Berserk was presented to its owner by a traveling merchant who himself found it in an eastern bazaar. This plot thread has not been revisited by the series because Miura switched gears and decided that Behelits can magically find their owners no matter the circumstances involved, but that happened when he started publishing the numbered chapters of Berserk. Before that, during the Golden Age prequel, we actually see Griffith discuss his acquisition of the Behelit with Guts, and it's a rather interesting conversation. He claims he received it from a gypsy fortune teller who told him that it would give him the world in exchange for his flesh and blood. Since he was a really young kid at that time, he didn't realize that she was being literal, but that statement only further cemented his ambition. This is symbolized by the fact that when the God Hand manipulates Griffith into joining them, Conrad and Ubik disguise themselves as the fortune teller who solidified his belief in conquest by any means necessary. It also highlights a curious trend whereby some of the most important demonic characters receive their Behelits from actual humans. The Slug Count was our introduction to Apostle 101, Griffith ended up becoming Berserk's main antagonist, and Ganishka, who was arguably the strongest apostle in existence, received his Behelit from his future wizard general, Daiba. Most other apostles received their Behelits from random locations, but not these three, and they're the ones who shaped our understanding of the Berserk-verse's dark side. His desire to rule the world literally changed the world. Staying on the topic of Behelits, once Griffith received his, he was already on track to becoming one of the most dangerous individuals to have ever lived. As a God Hand member, he would gain the power to shape human thoughts and actions from behind the astral scenes. But it goes beyond merely pulling strings with Griffith. His desire to become a ruler at all costs reshaped the entire world, and we wish that were a joke. The day Griffith became Femto was when the Age of Darkness began, metaphysically speaking. He was incarnated into the physical world to accomplish his personal goal of becoming king, and when he triggered the great roar of the astral world, his goal wasn't to bring magic and wonder back to the world, his goal was to create a world where he would be the one manipulating all the variables. As a God Hand, he became an essential part of the astral world, and his incarnation literally signaled the beginning of the end. Even the fact that Ganishka ended up becoming Shiva was by design, because the God Hand needed someone with that much astral energy to pull off bringing back Fantasia, and once Griffith realized that his mangled and tortured body couldn't get him the world he'd always dreamed of, after spending a year in the Tower of Rebirth, changing the world itself became his only option. Guru Gedfring remarks on the insanity of such a move in chapter 345. He accurately surmises that to establish the only kingdom within the world, Griffith changed the world itself, and all Guts can say is that that's the first step in his ambition to keep soaring higher and higher like the Falcon he truly is. Griffith was a voracious reader. Well, Griffith isn't exactly Chidi Anagonye when it comes to ethics and morality. He wasn't a dumb person by any means. Griffith was aware of the fact that to become king, he needed to excel in multiple aspects of life. And though he wasn't formally educated, he taught himself how to read to become his best possible version of a king. That's why, when he reached Midland and secured the title of Viscount, he filled his study with all sorts of books on topics that seem unrelated, but have a deeper connection in the grand scheme of things. When Guts visits Griffith in Chapter 9, he notes that his leader has more books again. Griffith tells him that half of his collection is just quote-unquote light reading, but when you pay attention to the genres he lists, you realize there's nothing light about them. Griffith was reading books on history, religion, philosophy, chemistry, tactics, and even cooking and cosmetics. He also had a berserkified version of the Kama Sutra, which Guts borrowed rather hesitantly. On the surface, these topics appear to be unrelated, but when you factor in his goal to become king, it makes a lot of sense why he lists these specific books. History, religion, philosophy, chemistry, and tactics have obvious applications for warfare and ruling, but cooking and cosmetics have their own uses within those contexts as well. Cosmetics specifically have applications in the subterfuge department, and we'll get to how the Kama Sutra was relevant in a later entry. Point is, he brushes these things off as light reading, but it's clear he's been preparing himself to tackle kingship from all fronts. And him being a voracious reader is evidenced by Guts' comment on the increase of books in his study, especially because he probably visits regularly as Griffith's raider captain. He was the best swordsman in the Band of the Falcon before Guts joined. This feels like a fact that shouldn't even be mentioned considering who replaced him as the best swordsman, but we felt it was worth mentioning because up until Guts joined the team, Griffith needed to be the best swordsman in his own band. Heck, he needed to be one of the best swordsmen in the world because mercenaries operate on the code of the sword. Duels often decide some of the most important aspects of mercenary life, and beyond that, Griffith simply didn't have a soldier whom he could rely on physically before he recruited the Black Swordsman. To that end, he trained his ass off and became a swordsman of such skill that he ran circles around Guts in their first two engagements. Granted, Guts was severely injured in both instances, but show us another Berserk character that can stand on their enemy's sword to disarm them, and we'll rescind that statement. Once he recruited Guts, Griffith became free to pursue other areas of importance that would be necessary to advance his agenda, because in his mind, no one could take down his raider captain. And that's part of the reason Guts was able to leave the Falcons as easily as he did. Had Griffith kept up his training and exposed himself to frontline danger during the Midland campaign, as he did during his mercenary days, that particular duel in the snow could have had a wildly different outcome, because that's how deep his knowledge of swordplay was. Even Casca couldn't touch him with her blade, and she was the second best fighter in the Falcons. Such was the amount of skill Griffith used to possess. His helmet design comes from a comedy film. One of the most iconic aspects of Griffith's character is the design of his battle helm. Griffith is known as the White Falcon of the field, and that isn't because he has pretty white hair. No, it's because he wears a battle helm that's fashioned in the likeness of a falcon's head, and throughout the several iterations of his character, that falcon head helmet remains consistent. It's with him during his pre-eclipse and post-eclipse campaigns, and his appearance as Femto basically turns his helmet into part of his anatomy. We wish we could have said that this design was a Miura original, but like many things in Berserk, it wasn't. Griffith's helmet design was inspired by the 1974 rock musical comedy horror film Phantom of the Paradise. The main character, Winslow Leach, wears a mask that looks disturbingly similar to Griffith's helmet, and once you make that connection, the inspiration becomes undeniable. Miura was often inspired by comedy shows and gag manga when he was creating his own moments of levity, but in this case, he took something that was intended to be comedic and turned it into an inseparable part of Griffith's identity. And while we're on the subject of designs, his character design is based on Oscar from The Rose of Versailles. Griffith's mask might come from a comedy film, but his entire character design comes from the most unexpected of sources for a series like Berserk, a classic shoujo manga. Before his passing, Miura stated in many interviews that Griffith was directly inspired by the character of Oscar from The Rose of Versailles. Oscar Francois de Jarget is a woman who was brought up as a man and, as a result, became an integral part of the French political system as depicted in Rose of Versailles. She was a proud woman who possessed martial capabilities beyond imagination, and she even became the friend and protector of the infamous French queen Marie Antoinette. Oscar wasn't hiding her gender from the court because of her military training. He was quite proud of being a woman in the military, but that didn't deter other ladies from the court from hitting on her, calling her beautiful, and you get the idea. Miura took this concept and reversed it with Griffith. He's a man who fights in the military, but his beauty surpasses that of any woman we've seen in Berserk. In fact, his male companions and peers often find themselves mesmerized by his beauty, much like the women that surrounded Oscar. Heck, Griffith's whole character design can be called Oscar-esque, and that isn't the only time shoujo manga would rear its head in his story. Griffith's intense feelings are inspired by shoujo manga. Kentaro Miura was a consumer of all kinds of manga. He would often remark that he tried looking for other avenues of expression in life, but in the end, manga was what he truly loved and dedicated himself to. To that end, he was receptive to all kinds of manga genres, with shoujo manga being of particular interest to him. If shonen is all about action and logic, shoujo is all about emotion and the illogical human mind. In an interview, he said that there is no other manga medium that does emotion as well as shoujo, and that he was inspired to create Guts and Griffith's character dynamics thanks to that genre. In fact, he emphasized that most of Griffith's feelings are shoujo-esque, and when you look at the rare moments where we do get his internal dialogue, it certainly feels that way. The example we want to bring up in this video is his infamous rant from chapter 49. After spending a year being tortured to insanity within the Tower of Rebirth, Griffith acknowledges to himself that only two things have sustained his soul: his dream and Guts's. Griffith's dream was what kept his feet moving his entire life. He did everything he did in service of his dream. He was willing to become a martyr for his dream, but ever since he met Guts, that dream had begun to fade, and Guts was replacing its image. He describes a number of conflicting feelings he has towards the man he blames for his imprisonment: malice, friendship, sorrow, tenderness, pain, hunger. He calls these feelings a tidal wave that keeps washing over him, and he both blames Guts and is thankful to him for keeping him alive through his torment. This swirling mass of feelings Griffith has for Guts is the most shoujo thing ever, and chapter 49 displays the kind of all-consuming grip it can have on a person, which is a key trait of that genre of manga. His armor changes design based on his existential form. While Griffith's falcon helmet remains a constant in regards to his character design, the rest of his armor changes based on his quote-unquote evolution. When he's introduced to Berserk, he wears a rather modest, undecorated suit of armor that isn't even complete. The most eye-catching thing about it is the unadorned breastplate and helmet. But as he starts rising through the ranks, and Berserk changes arcs like seasons, you start noticing that his armor is becoming more and more elaborate. In the first numbered chapter of Berserk, 3 years have passed since Guts joined the Falcons, and the White Falcon can now afford a proper suit of armor. He's got the whole shebang on, gauntlets, greaves, you name it, but the design of it, while elaborate, isn't anything to write home about. Griffith's armor in the Golden Age is all about functionality. It has all the openings and layers that grant him protection and maneuverability, it lines up with his Falcon motifs but doesn't overdo it, and is perfect for military use. That cannot be said for the armor he dons post-incarnation, because that one is all about cementing his position as the Falcon of Light. Griffith's armor, after he returns to Earth, is so elaborate it truly feels like fantasy armor. It has feather and falcon motifs running all over it, from the base of the helm to the steel boots he wears. His horse's armor undergoes a similar upgrade, sprouting wings from its hind as though it were Pegasus, but the most important change is the addition of wings on the left side of Griffith's armor set. This is a reference to the one-winged angel trope made famous by Sephiroth from Final Fantasy. Miura added this design element to signify Griffith's status as a demon king. The people of Berserk don't have console video games just yet, so they can't make that association, but we the readers can, and Griffith's current armor set is a reflection of all the negative ideals associated with kings: opulence, extravagance, tyranny, and evil. If those words seem out of place to you, then just take a look at the Falcon's castle that towers over Falconia and get back to us. We'll be waiting for your comments. He was the first commoner to become a general of Midland. This is a fact that feels like it bears repeating because, traditionally speaking, the position of a general is reserved for nobility in the world of Berserk. The sons and grandsons of previous generals and military commanders take over their posts, and the Holy Iron Chain Knights is an order that's comprised entirely of nobility. That's exactly why Griffith's rise through the ranks of Midland's nobility is so unprecedented, because it simply doesn't happen in this world. Berserk places a lot of emphasis on tradition and status when dealing with its upper class, because that's how upper class families have retained power, historically speaking. Yet, in the first numbered chapter of the series, Griffith is given the title of Viscount, which took him from being a commoner to a nobleman. Within 30 chapters, he jumped several ranks and became the first commoner general in all of Midland, an achievement that was secured thanks to his exploits both on and off the field. Many attempts were made on his life precisely because he was a commoner, but thanks to the current of causality, Griffith always survived, and that only served to further antagonize his enemies. His becoming the White Phoenix General is a commentary on the class systems that were perpetuated by noble families in the Middle Ages, and it's a damn shame that he ended up becoming just like them instead of revolutionizing the system. He doesn't consciously think of the Falcons as his friends. This is a fact that goes against what happened during the eclipse, because the eclipse proved that Griffith did love and care for his soldiers, but in his conscious moments, he didn't even think of them as friends, just people who clung to his dream. In Chapter 12, Griffith reveals to Charlotte his definition of a friend. He says that only a person that can dedicate themselves entirely to the pursuit of their own dream, even if it meant crossing swords with him, was worthy of being his friend. Because to him, that would mean that they're equals. It's this definition of a friend that inspires Guts to leave the Falcons in the first place, and despite being in the pits of despair and insanity, Griffith at least acknowledges their friendship in Chapter 49. But when it comes to the rest of the Falcons, he doesn't care so much, because to him, they're not friends. They're possessions he's collected in the course of his journey, tools he can use to further his own agenda. And it's this mentality that takes away all the human feelings when he decides to accept the God Hand's offer. As his soul sinks into the abyss, Griffith has no remorse, no regret, because his conscious mind tells him that they were nothing to him. Of course, we know that if that were the case, they wouldn't have qualified as sacrifices, but he doesn't. In fact, there's a lot Griffith doesn't know about himself, and that is what leads to the eclipse in the first place. Griffith thinking that he's superior to the very people who earned him his rank and title is what causes the eclipse, not the Crimson Behelit, because if he just took a beat and reevaluated his thought process, perhaps he wouldn't be a demon king today. Griffith thinks Pippin is his most loyal soldier. While he doesn't really care for any of his comrades the way he cares about Guts, there is one among them who found a place in Griffith's life beyond military service. That guy is Pippin, and ironically enough, it's because of his unwavering loyalty that he finds a place in Griffith's other life. In Chapter 72, which serves as the prelude to the eclipse, we see Griffith escape his comrades by commandeering a wagon. As he rushes to the site of the eclipse, he hits a bump in the road and goes flying into a lake. When he's airborne, Griffith has a vision of an alternate life, one where he accepts his broken self and moves on from his dream of conquest, and in that dream, we see that he has a dog called Pippin. We'll revisit this dream at a later point in the video because it relates to another character we haven't touched on yet, but here's the reason why it's so important. This dream is basically a vision of what would have happened had Griffith not used his Behelit, and Pippin being the name of man's best friend indicates that Griffith held him in high regard for his unquestioning loyalty. Still, the fact that he's a dog in the dream also tells us that, in the end, none of the other Falcons deserved human status in Griffith's mind, and Pippin was lucky to get a dog named after him in that alternate timeline. His sword and horse are nameless so far. While Griffith's naming canines after his most loyal soldier in his dreams, he isn't doing the same thing for his mount or his blade in his waking life. This is kinda odd, because most fantasy series place emphasis on naming such weapons and creatures, especially if they're swords and horses. A warrior's blade is an extension of their body, and their steed is just as important. They're given names to portray how they work in tandem with a human, and horse names especially have a bonding factor with regards to their riders. Heck, the most famous blade in Berserk is called Dragon Slayer, and while Guts doesn't usually ride a horse into battle, if he had a mount to match Skull Knights, we feel like he would have named it. So the fact that Griffith's sword and horse remain nameless is indicative of his lack of humanity. Unlike George R.R. Martin's fantasy series, where every damn horse and sword has a name, Miura opted to keep things anonymous with his antagonist. The primary implication of this is that Griffith isn't too emotional when it comes to living his life, and so he finds no reason to humanize things or creatures that, to him, are just tools. It reinforces this sense of otherization that's prevalent in much of Griffith's life and shows us that sometimes not giving something important a named identity can be just as impactful as a magical black blade called Stormbringer. He remains undefeated in his military career. Now, this fact is probably known by most Berserk fans, but when it comes to official combat, Griffith remains undefeated, both pre- and post-eclipse. While he might not have had a grip on his own emotions and how they affected the lives of everyone around them, Griffith had complete control over his mind, and this allowed him to concoct some of the most lethal and effective battle strategies that the Berserkverse has seen to date. The first example of this came on the night that Guts was deployed as a Falcon. It was a supply raid, a relatively high-risk, low-reward operation, but the way Griffith laid out and executed the plan impressed even a veteran merc like Guts. He took into account everything: enemy posts, the terrain, the friggin' wind, and the window of escape they'd have once the supplies went up in flames. It was this ingenuity that convinced Guts to stay with the Falcons, and things didn't slow down once Griffith joined up with Midland. His diversion tactics at the Battle of Doldry secured a fortress Midland couldn't recover in a century. He used the bulk of his army to draw out all of Doldry's defenders, while a smaller unit, led by Casca, took the castle itself. Once the castle was lost, the Tudor soldiers in the field broke, and Griffith accomplished what was previously thought as impossible. After his rebirth as Femto and the subsequent incarnation into the physical world, he became the Absolute, but his strategies remained just as ingenious. He had used a token force to infiltrate Kushan-occupied Wyndham, and while that force had Emperor Ganishka occupied, Griffith and Zodd rescued Princess Charlotte from the Tower of Rebirth. No matter how we feel about him as a man, if we were ever in an unfavorable military position, we'd want Griffith running point on our attacks and defense because he's just that good as a wartime leader, and his undefeated record speaks more of him than he himself does. He damaged Zodd more than Guts. One of the earliest hints about Griffith's fate came from his first encounter with Nosferatu Zodd. And no, we're not talking about the fact that Zodd spared him and Guts after noticing Griffith's crimson Behelit. We're talking about the fact that not even Guts was able to harm the Immortal One to the extent Griffith did. That's right, folks. While Guts might have been the first human to give Zodd a proper challenge in his 300 years of slaughter, he was incapable of removing entire limbs from his body. Guts couldn't even run him through with the Dragon Slayer's predecessor in his base form, whereas Griffith? Well, Griffith took Zodd's arm in his first strike against the Big Black Lion. Guts had already earned the Immortal One's respect with his inhuman defense against Zodd's inhuman strikes, but Griffith managed to sever Zodd's left arm in his apostle form with his first move. That was enough for Zodd to respect him as someone worthy of his time, seeing as he damaged him more than Guts did in a fraction of the time. This also wouldn't be the last time these two came to blows, because Zodd's next fight with Griffith has an unprecedented outcome. Griffith is the only person to defeat Nosferatu Zodd. In chapter 128, long after the eclipse is done and dusted, we see the Immortal One killing a bunch of human soldiers to keep his bloodlust satisfied. After he's done doing his Zodd thing, he sits upon a pile of corpses and thinks back on his life as an apostle. Zodd laments the fact that there really isn't anyone in the human or apostle world who can stand up to him. He thinks that there really isn't anyone besides the wretched Skull Knight that can fit his criteria for strength, and he gives Guts a brief thought considering the massive kill count he's amassed in his time as the Black Swordsman. Just as he thinks about his desire to fight the strongest, a white falcon appears amongst the carrion crows feasting on the Zodd-made corpses. This falcon tells him that their encounter occurs within the dusk between dreams and consciousness, and Zodd immediately understands that this is Griffith, or rather Femto. When he asks the God Hand member why he was visiting him, Femto replies that what Zodd desired wasn't words. The Immortal immediately understands this challenge and prepares to fight his god, but is defeated in one miraculous strike. Griffith takes Zodd's left horn from him and cleaves his face in half in the space between dream and reality, and when they return to the physical world, Zodd is confused about what happened, but then he feels the blood flowing from where his horn should have been, he sees the horn lying in front of him, and he knows instinctively that he just lost a duel to the absolute definition of strength. That's why, from that point onward, Zodd becomes Griffith's willing right hand, because he knows he can't beat the guy. This makes Griffith the only person to have conclusively beaten the Immortal One, a feat that even Skull Knight couldn't achieve, and that places him in the upper echelon of fighters in Berserk after his embarrassing loss to Guts in the snow. His birth was predestined centuries ago. Considering the fact that Behelits are supposedly presented to those marked by the threads of causality, it should be no surprise that Griffith's existence itself was part of fate's plan, but figuring it out is one thing, being told that exact same statement by the entity that governs fate itself is a whole different ballgame. In the deleted chapter 83, when Griffith meets the idea of evil, he learns that all his ideas about destiny and free will were completely wrong. He thought all his life that he'd been accomplishing things off of the strength of his back and the sharpness of his mind. That's why he had so much pride in himself. But when the idea told him that everything he had done was decided centuries ago, Griffith let go of the veneer of ego and free will and submitted entirely to its mercy. The idea revealed that Griffith's birth had been decided upon a very long time before he was even conceived. His bloodline, his life experiences, the context within which he rose and fell, all of it were by design. Confronted with the power of this godlike entity, Griffith found himself not arguing, but agreeing and asking for guidance, which was kind of a first for him. And even when the idea told him to be as he wished to be, it was manipulating him to follow through on its own conceptions of fate and evil. Griffith's birth being predestined centuries ago isn't a prediction, it's a spoiler, as is the next related point on our list. He's Berserk's Antichrist, posing as Christ. Part of the reason Griffith's birth and rebirth was predestined is that he's connected to a rather horrifying prophecy. The Holy See gets a lot of things wrong in the world of Berserk, but this prophetic warning, they got right. When the sun dies a fifth time and a red lake appears west of a city with a name both old and new, the fifth angel will alight. That angel is the Falcon of Darkness, the king of the blind white sheep and the master of the sinful black sheep. This falcon will bring about the Age of Darkness, and that's exactly what happens right after Griffith's eclipse. When the idea of evil tells him that his birth was decided upon centuries ago, it isn't talking about Griffith's bloodline alone. It's talking about the context within which he will rise and take control of the world, and as the Falcon of Light, he's convinced everyone around him that he's Berserk Jesus. He can fly through the air, probably walk on water, and definitely performs miracles that feel Christ-like. The Holy See's central religious symbol is the falcon in flight, and it's that symbol that allowed Griffith to pose as its mythical savior. For those uninitiated in the ways of Arcana, Griffith definitely feels like Berserk Jesus, but in reality he's more like the Antichrist. That's because we, the readers, know that all his benevolent acts are false. He doesn't care about people, he won't be willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of humanity, he's doing it all because he wants to rule the world in his way, shape it in his own likeness, and that's why all of his followers are doomed. Griffith isn't the son of God, he's the fifth member of the evil God Hand, and being part of such a metaphysical group comes with perks. As a God Hand, he can manipulate the concept of space. This entry is probably going to be the shortest of this entire list because Griffith's power as a God Hand is both simple and terrifying. Femto's signature ability is spatial manipulation, and it isn't like Void's ability that allows him to open portals in the fabric of space-time. Femto can manipulate the space around him to achieve pretty much any goal he wishes. During the eclipse, he was a newly born God Hand, so he couldn't control it well. He ended up killing a few apostles trying to stop Skull Knight from escaping with Guts and Casca, but as the years rolled on, he became so adept at controlling space that he tanked cannon fire from Guts at real close range. He's capable of phasing in and out of existence almost, which allows him to dodge unavoidable hails of arrows, and his greatest display of power came when he broke the columns of Ganishka's mobile palace and summoned the wind to blow away his released form. He also turned a space-cutting slash from Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation into the tool that triggered the great roar of the astral world, so there you have it, folks. If he wasn't powerful enough with an army of biological slaves who also happen to be all-powerful demons, he can also just crush your body outright if you get anywhere near him. That's the kind of power he now possesses, and yet his method of dispatching key enemies is rather curious. He has a tendency to stab people in their right eye. This technically started with Governor Genin, but if you read through all the chapters in which Griffith makes an appearance, you'll notice he has a tendency to stab people in their right eye. As we said, his first eye-popping victim was Genin himself, who he left in the dust that was settling over the Tudor Empire's defeat during the Battle for Doldry. After that, he became incapable of hurting anyone thanks to all the torture he endured, but when he came back to Earth, he continued this most curious trend. He dispatched several Kushan commanders during Midland's war with the Kushan Empire using this exact method, flying over to their positions and then stabbing them in their right eye. Before the eclipse, it felt random, but now we know it represents the eye he took from Guts. Well, technically, he didn't take it. One of the apostles he commands took it after getting the Master's instruction to hold him down, but that is a key reason behind Griffith's tendency to stab people in their right eye. He essentially keeps recreating the one murder he wanted to commit personally, and we're pretty sure he'll keep doing it until he gets it right. Griffith doesn't feel anything for Charlotte. If you know anything about our boy Griffith, you know that he doesn't care about the princess he's planning to marry one bit. Charlotte is, and always has been, his meal ticket, nothing more. We're pretty sure that Kama Sutra we mentioned at the beginning of our video was requested by him with the sole purpose of seducing the princess, which he ends up doing when Guts leaves the Falcons. The whole time he was piping down Charlotte, he kept thinking about Guts, because he wasn't sleeping with her due to mutual attraction, he was sleeping with her to regain power over his own life. In doing so, he also collapses his own ambition, but it's what he does during his rescue mission that cements our suspicions. If Griffith truly felt anything for Charlotte, he'd have taken her with him even after she took a poison dart to the arm, consequences be damned. But he told her to go with Anna, because to him, she was just a burden. And after becoming a god hand, he can no longer feel anything, so everything he does with Charlotte is purely for the fulfillment of his dream. She's the key to the throne of Midland, and Midland, or rather Falconia, is now the only safe haven for humans in this world. Griffith's betrothal to Charlotte means that he's now on track to becoming the official king of the world, and that's the only value she has in his life. But speaking of who he was thinking about when he slept with her, his sexuality is up for debate. One of the biggest questions surrounding Griffith is his sexual orientation. It's clear he lives in a heterosexual society, but he's done things that go against those societal norms. Griffith's willingness to sleep with Governor Gennon to get the funds he felt were necessary for his band shows his practicality, yes, but if he were truly heterosexual, then he might have found a similar target from the opposite gender. Granted, it would have been a much more difficult task, but he could have done it. Similarly, him thinking about Guts while throwing down with Charlotte feels like something that's rooted in power dynamics, but when you take a closer look at the emotional aspect, it can be said that Griffith's intense longing for Guts led him to Charlotte's bedchamber. Griffith's sexuality has always confused Berserk readers, so much so that many of them have created some of the most sensual and shocking boy love panels in fanfiction history. But we believe that was intentional on Miura's part. He wanted his main antagonist to retain an air of mystery for as long as he could have pulled it off realistically. Even before Griffith's incarnation, when he planned to remove much of his internal dialogue, we only got rare glimpses inside the Falcon's mind. So, if you ask us, we think Griffith is at the very least bi-curious, if not entirely bisexual. Sadly, we won't get the answer from Miura-sensei anymore for reasons that should be obvious. Griffith may have loved Casca in his own twisted way. This point is where we revisit that dream where we discovered that Griffith thinks Pippin was his most loyal soldier. In chapter 72, Griffith has a vision of the life he could lead if he accepts his situation for what it is. At that point, he'd lost the ability to walk, handle things with his own hands, and even his tongue had been taken from him. He was an invalid in every way possible, and that's one of the reasons why he triggered the eclipse. The vision we're talking about is a life where he accepts his invalid status and moves on from his dream, and in that vision, Casca is his wife. They live in a small cottage in the countryside with Casca's sword and a band of the Falcon's shield adorning their dining room. They have a dog, Pippin, whom we've commented on already, and more importantly, they have a child whom they've named Guts. This isn't in honor of a fallen comrade, though. In this vision, Guts is still alive and swinging his sword out there somewhere. It begins with Casca opening the windows to their dining room to let some light in. She then asks Griffith if he was dreaming and chastises her son Guts for bullying their dog, Pippin. She then starts feeding Griffith soup while saying that this domestic life feels much more natural to her, and for a second, alternate Griffith agrees. He thinks to himself that this peaceful existence isn't so bad, and it's in that moment his Behelit appears in the soup Casca's feeding him, and he snaps out of the vision. The implications of this scene are many, and none of them are good. We'll focus on the one most relevant to this video, and that's the idea that Griffith loved Casca in his own twisted way. There's absolutely no other reason for his unconscious mind to conjure up the scenario we just described. The Griffith we know would never look at Casca as a romantic companion because he had dreams of becoming king. Sure, he might not love Charlotte, but he knew he and Casca would never work. However, in this vision, none of those ambitions exist, and he allows himself a moment of true clarity. In that moment, he realizes he not only wants to marry Casca, he wants to have a child with her and name it Guts, because that's how much he cares for the two of them. But alas, much like a teenager hopped up on hormones, he chooses to burn a good thing to the ground instead of bearing the pain that would come with it. In the end, Griffith chose himself and his own ambitions, and that's why when we see him violating Casca, it hits harder than anything else in manga history. It's not that he felt anything for her when he was assaulting her, because he didn't. The hearts of the God Hand are frozen, and they no longer feel human emotions. It's that his final conscious thought was of marrying her and fathering a son with her, and he still ended up violating her virtue. It's stuff like this that makes Griffith such a compelling villain, because what he does is totally wrong, but we can understand why he does it, and that makes us feel wrong as well. But while we're on the topic of Griffith fathering children, he can't keep Casca away from himself for too long because of the demon child. Griffith's incarnation went off without a major hitch, or that's what he'd like to tell everyone. The truth is, he hit a major snag during the incarnation ceremony because someone who wasn't supposed to be sympathetic to humanity or the world they created ended up doing something out of sympathy. Shortly before the egg of the perfect world triggered the incarnation, he swallowed Guts and Casca's demon child. He did this because he felt a kinship with the child who was dying now that his power was spent. The demon child is the only reason Casca survived the Conviction Arc's events up until Guts reached St. Albion, and without him, she feels empty. But she also recognizes that he hasn't died yet, because when Griffith visits the Hill of Swords post-incarnation, Casca is drawn to the essence of her child that resides within his vessel. She reaches out to Griffith, not to be close to him, but to be close to her son, the same son that was demonized thanks to Femto's seed. In a way, Griffith did get to fulfill his final dream as a human, but the way he went about it still haunts us to this day. Putting that aside, because the demon child is a part of his vessel, Griffith feels things when Casca's nearby. After all, she is the kid's mother. This also lets him know that he can no longer risk her being too far from him. The thing is, every night of the full moon, Griffith transforms into the Moonlight Boy, who uses the branches of the world spiral tree to find and spend time with Casca. The child's instinctive need for its mother exposes Griffith's position, where he becomes a king far away from his throne. This is why he decides to kidnap Casca and bring her to Falconia, because at least that way, he won't disappear from the city without warning. In a rather ironic twist, he has to keep the woman he doesn't want anything to do with constantly by his side, otherwise he risks exposing himself to the outside world. And another reason Griffith kidnapped her is the only time he's truly vulnerable is when he becomes the Moonlight Boy. While Griffith might be an all-powerful, godlike being, the demon child was not. He had a body of flesh mutated by demonic seed which bestowed him with magical powers. That truth about his existence remained constant when he was swallowed by the egg of the perfect world, leading to a scenario where not only does Griffith abandon his seat every night of the full moon, he also becomes fully vulnerable. Unlike Griffith, the Moonlight Boy is not a God Hand member. He has a body of flesh with the mind of a 4-year-old and the magic power of a 400-year-old. And we know that he can most likely be killed because when Griffith transforms back into his original form at Elfhelm, Guts misses all the shots he sends towards him, save for the strand of black hair he nicks off his majestic mane. That might seem like nothing, but it makes all the difference from an astral perspective. Griffith was still mid-transformation when Guts charged him, and the only part of his body that received damage belonged to the Moonlight Boy. Usually, no one can touch him with a projectile, and Guts personally learned that it was impossible to hack and slash his way to victory now that Griffith was the absolute. But cutting off hair that belonged to the Moonlight Boy implies that the boy can be killed, and if the boy is killed, then Griffith too would cease to exist. This means he's only truly vulnerable when he has no control over his own body and needs Casca to be by his side. And that's a recipe for disaster waiting to strike, because if the only way to defeat him is to kill the Moonlight Boy, then a person would have to go through Casca, and if they end up killing Casca, then Berserk's entire narrative might as well be meaningless. He's sending human souls to the abyss. It's chilling irony that Griffith is using meaning to condemn the souls of the innocent, because if you think for a second that his soul-based light shows are taking people to heaven instead of hell, then you're truly naive. Following his incarnation, one of the reasons Griffith was accepted as the Falcon of Light is because he showed his followers that life didn't end with death. He took to conducting regular funerals where he would pull out the souls of the deceased from their bodies so their family members and loved ones could say their goodbyes. This tactic secured him tons of support from the Holy See and all other adherents of Berserk Christianity, but it's a complete lie, because unlike what the people believe, Griffith is sending those drawn souls straight to hell, and he's doing it to increase his own power. Remember that apostles draw their strength from the number of sacrifices they make, the quality of the sacrifice itself, their ego at the time of their death, and the fissure that links them to the abyss. But God Hand members are composed of pure abyssal energy, meaning that the more souls that swirl within the vortex, the more power they gain. Considering he aims to bring the whole planet under his control, it makes sense why he needs more juice despite being a godlike entity. But it still doesn't make what he's doing right. He's condemning souls that served him loyally to a fate that's worse than death, because in the abyss, all you'll find is eternal torment. So, by giving people the impression of salvation, he's stealing it from them, and we only hope someone can catch on to this before it's too late. Only Sonia can match his sense of astral perception. This might seem like a silly point considering how stubborn Sonia is in her affection for him, but the only reason Griffith keeps her around is because she's the only one who can match his sense of astral perception. Sonia was born with the gift of prophecy. She's a walking, talking oracle, and she often spits prophetic bars without her knowledge. That's because when the oracle takes possession of her mind, she forgets who she is and can never recall the prophecies she's made about others. But more than that, her astral sensitivity makes her mind see things regular humans just can't, and that makes her a critical asset for Griffith. On many occasions, he's used Sonia's sight to streamline his offensive against an enemy. By having her read the flow of ode on a battlefield, he can target war generals directly, sparing the lesser recruits and possibly converting them to his side. After obliterating the giants that were plaguing the lands beside Falconia, he uses Sonia as a guide to get his army back home by using sky paths, ancient magical gateways that connect two distant locations on Earth. Sonia can also help him carry out his soul salvation charade, because she, like Griffith, can distinguish one soul from another. While Shirke is capable of doing the exact same things, what makes Sonia different is the fact that she can do all of this without any sort of magical training. And magical training doesn't just teach you the ways of Arcana, it also teaches you the morality of it. Griffith clearly doesn't want any of the latter to rub off on Sonia, because otherwise she'll start asking questions he won't have pleasant answers for. As Griffemto, he can only be harmed by those who truly don't desire him. For our final Griffith fact, we'd like to highlight a simple truth, and that is that he, even as Femto, can only be harmed by those who truly don't desire him. All of Berserk hinges on that one word, desire. Desire takes many forms besides sexual. Desire can be vengeful, worshipful, ambitious, whatever you want it to be. The only word that ties those things together is desire, and that abstraction is definitely at play in the series. When Griffith was incarnated into the physical world, we're told that it was only possible because everyone in the vicinity of the Tower of Conviction desired him. Now, you might be thinking, but Guts was there as well, and he wants to kill Griffith. Well, to kill him, he needed to find him first, and Griffith's incarnation fulfilled that desire. Femto's return to Earth as Griffith was only possible because it was desired. However, Rickert then shook up that whole equation by entering his city and slapping him across the face. Rickert is a guy who's generally filled with love and kindness. He used to idolize Griffith and was extremely glad to see him at the Hill of Swords. Back then, he was unaware of his former friend's crimes, but now that he knows, he's decided to move on. Right after laying the slap heard round the universe across Griffith's cheeks, Rickert tells him that the White Falcon was his leader. The Falcon of Light means nothing to him, and that means that Rickert has truly moved on from Griffith. He no longer desires his presence in his life in any way, shape, or form, and that's why his slap landed the way it did. It's cruel irony that in order to harm the object of his hatred, Guts has to move past hate, but that's the moral lesson Berserk's been trying to teach us since day one. Fate isn't inherently cyclical. It feels that way because humans keep making the same choice over and over again. So, if the key to breaking fate is to move past it, then the day Guts decides to let go of his own desire for vengeance is the day he'll be able to finally lay his hands on Griffemto. If fate is indeed a spiral, and not a circle as Flora says, then Guts will have to realize that before he can do something about it. And if his current residence in a Kushan stupa does change his mind, then we can see Berserk ending pretty soon. If not, Griffith will win, and the world will end, or it even gets a chance to heal. That is the cruel grace of the ungodly god born of man, not whatever the God Hand has been doing for a millennium. Marvelous verdict! And with that, we've arrived at the conclusion of this video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below because we're dying to hear them. Let us know if we missed any Griffith facts you want to share, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Marvelous Anime for more Berserk content just like this video. We'll see you guys soon, but until then, stay safe, and remember, keep on struggling, strugglers.